Welcome to the Voices for Change virtual tour. Today's webinar, Treating Perpetrators of Intimate Partner Violence, is brought to you by our presenting partners, Emerge and Transition House, and made possible by our sponsors, Century Bank, Citizens Bank, Eastern Bank, Harvard University Employees Credit Union, and Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'm Tracy Schott. I'm a social worker and a filmmaker and the creator of Voices for Change. We are broadcasting live today from Boston, Massachusetts to talk about treating perpetrators of intimate partner violence. Thank you for joining us, and I want to welcome our panelists. Today we're joined by Dr. David Adams, co-founder and co-director of Emerge, the nation's first counseling program for men who abuse women. Dr. Susan Cayouette, co-director of Emerge and a 34-year veteran in counseling and education of abusers. Sarah Gyrog. Sarah is executive director of the Transition House, the first shelter for victims of domestic violence on the East Coast. Raneep Barkai, assistant director of the Transition House, who has worked with survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual assault for over 30 years. Susan Clare, a survivor of intimate partner violence whose late husband received services from Emerge more than 25 years ago. And Damion, a client of Emerge who is here to share his journey and the impact the program has had on him. Since we began this series of webinars discussing topics related to intimate partner violence, we've talked about how pervasive and destructive this problem is in the United States and globally. We've described IPV as a pandemic that affects more people than the COVID-19 pandemic. Unfortunately, there's no vaccine that will make this problem disappear, but there are solutions. Community awareness, effective intervention with survivors, and abuser education are key. So we're going to start with you, Dr. Adams. You were a pioneer in working with abusers. Tell us a bit about how that happened.
Sure. And the Emerge was founded by 10 men. I was the youngest of them at age 24. I think there were 5 of us were social workers, and there was one professor, one lawyer, a cab driver, and 2 students. So those are the 10 men. And what we had in common was that we were friends of women who had started Transition House, and they were getting calls on their hotline from men that wanted help as abusers. And Transition House was working with victims, and so they didn't really feel that it was their mission to work with abusers, but they still felt that abusers should get help. And so they asked us as a group of men that they knew and trusted whether we would be interested in taking this on. And so we decided that it was an interesting challenge, and we began to research the issue. Very little was written in 1977 about domestic violence. And so really the best way to learn about the problem was to talk to survivors of abuse. And so we invited survivors to come and share their stories with us. And I remember one evening at my apartment, we sat around on the floor and listened to an audio tape that one of the survivors, she'd convinced her estranged husband to send it to us, in which he was kind of reflecting on his experience as an abuser. And, he was clearly wanting her back. And so what really was striking about it to us was that he, even though he was apologizing, he was also kind of romanticizing his abusive behavior and making excuses. And so it was very eye-opening for us because we were very naive. We thought, well, we'll just tell them it's wrong. Those are the 10 founders there that you're seeing, by the way. So it just became a lot more complicated. How do we kind of, break through their denial and their rationalization? And so we continued to meet with some of the founders of Transition House, and we were very accountable to them. We were very keen on getting their ideas and running things by them and really kind of like brainstorming with them about what the approach should be and so forth. And so really that was our beginning. 1977. Staying Alive was the number one song of the country, by the way. Postal stamps were 4 cents at that point.
Oh my goodness. 4 cents? It seems incredible. So tell us about the philosophy of Emerge. How do you approach this work?
Well, I mean, I think the single most important statistic is that 100% of domestic violence is caused by abusers. And so what follows from that is the idea that why should we expect victims to uproot their lives and their children's lives? Why shouldn't the burden of change be on the person who's causing the problem, right? Because even if we shelter a victim, the average abuser is going to go on and abuse between 2 and 4 new victims in his lifetime, right? And also adversely affect children. And so there's going to be new generations of abusers, that come, from his children, in many cases. And so really kind of that's the inspiration, and so, but we wanted also an approach that was really about accountability, and not just criminal justice accountability, because I think that we've kind of come to understand that we can't arrest our way out of this problem. That change really needs to be broader than just criminal sanctions. That so even if people sort of end up going to prison, that doesn't mean they're going to stop being abusive. For one thing, and every abuser is surrounded by people, friends, and relatives that are either potentially helping them to change or probably more typically enabling them to be abusive. And so we always believed that the intervention should be equally devoted to community change, not just individual change. We also believed in reaching out to partners. And so a very big part of our approach is to do what we call partner contact, where we reach out to the partners and get their perspective, and give them our perspective about the change process and what's happening with the abuser. And so really those are kind of some of the key elements of our approach.
Transition House has been in existence for 45 years. Tell us a little bit about how Transition House has evolved.
Well, you're exactly right, Tracy. A lot of people think about Transition House as being just a shelter, and that's partly our fault because our name is Transition House. So in 1976, our shelter opened and our organization became a formal nonprofit. But before that, 2 women who are survivors of domestic violence came together and actually opened up their own home to survivors of domestic violence and their children to move in. And that's the founding story of Transition House. And it's actually a very similar story to many of the domestic violence programs across the country and shelters across the country that began to emerge in the 1970s, related to the women's movement and an acknowledgement that what happened in the home, that what was personal was actually political, that people needed to come together in a collective way to address what was happening to women behind closed doors and to children. But our movement has changed a lot since those early days. And part of that is that, I mean, if I nodded as often as I agree with what David is saying, I would just be nodding the whole time, because we came to see that sheltering people will not end domestic violence. And so not only did the founders and those early folks in the collective ask for Emerge to begin and do their work, but over the years, the people of Transition House realized we need to do more than only sheltering. We also need to have what David talked about, to be equally devoted to community and community change as we are to sheltering. So our shelter houses 9 families at one time. We're always full. Every single day we're full. And so we realized that there needed to be also community intervention. And in 2013, a community team was born here, and different efforts have happened through the life cycle of Transition House. But we now have a community team that's equally robust to our housing team.
Transition House has worked with Emerge from the beginning. Talk to us about how that relationship helps you serve survivors.
Well, survivors ask us what happens on the other side, you can call it. What happens when my abuser, the person who causes me harm, goes to batter's intervention? And when I started working at Transition House, I hadn't done the actual Emerge training. Those were one of the things that I wanted to do, to experience what it is to go through intimate partner violence education, so I could describe it to the clients, so they know when they're calling what will happen. Should I send the person that causes me harm to get help? It's really important that we know exactly to describe what's happening so we can describe it to our clients. Another really good thing that happens in the collaboration with Emerge is that David and other staff from Emerge come and talk to our clients in different workshops about warning signs and what happens also in your next relationship. What are the things that you should look out for? Really describing in some ways the brain and the thinking of someone that causes harm. So there's so many ways we collaborate. We've trained our community together, going back to the community. We've trained Cambridge Police Department, the fire department, many agencies together. This is something where we don't feel that the Intimate Partner Violence Agency is on one end and we're on the other end. This is about doing things together, community impact together.
I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into what that program looks like at Emerge. You sat through it. I know Susan Clare, who we're going to meet later, also took the training. Susan, Dr. Caillouette, why don't you talk to us a little bit about the Emerge program and kind of give us some details about that?
Most of the work we're doing occurs in groups and occasionally individually, but we have a basic philosophy, I think, that we should be clear about, because it's really important. We believe that people who are abusive and controlling and hurtful to their partners are doing it because they're making choices to do it. So our belief has always been that people can change, okay? That people make a choice to be controlling or hurtful or violent, and they can also make a choice not to do that. And that's important because otherwise, we would be seen more as an extension of the court or prison system, where we're just holding people, for a time. But we actually, want to educate people and talk about what they're doing, and also expect that they make changes in their life. And some people will make changes, and other people will also make choices to continue to be violent. But we want people to be really clear that they have the ability to stop being abusive if they want to stop being abusive. So a lot of the education and work we do in groups is sort of geared towards both educating and challenging men and women who are abusive and controlling to stop that behavior and try other behaviors. I'm going to talk a little bit about the system we use in groups, because that's primarily what we do with abusers. Okay. We have a 2-tier system. Okay. What we call the first stage and the second stage. And the first stage is 8 weeks long. It's very educational, one session per week for 2 hours. We usually have 2 group leaders if there's more than 6 people in a group, and often there are between 10 and 15 group members. Next slide. Yeah. So the group is focused on getting them to describe their weekly behavior, if there's any abusive, controlling, hurtful behavior or incidents of violence. And also eventually, after they've been in there 7 or 8 times, to talk about the incident or incidents that led to them being referred to the abuser education program, or they may have chosen to voluntarily attend too. Okay, so every week we're going to do a very short check-in, and we're also going to do a lesson, okay, along with the check-ins. We want them to, our goals are that they participate in the program, and we're trying to educate them about abuse, controlling behavior, hurtful behavior, more than they come in with, because people often come in with sort of narrow preconceptions about what abuse is. It's only hitting or it's only something that results with somebody going to the hospital. We want to expand that notion of what is abusive behavior and talk about controlling behavior that prevents people from doing what they want to do or forces them to do other things, and hurtful behavior. So we want to broaden the spectrum of what abuse is perceived as. We expect that they're going to stop being physically abusive while they're in the group, but the other forms of abuse we're going to be working on while they're in the program. Next slide. Yeah. So the way that we do that in the first stage group is we have 8 lessons, and they're sort of core lessons about what is violence and different types of abuse, for instance, describing what violent behavior is, and then also alternatively what controlling behavior is, and giving examples and asking for the participants in the group to give their own examples, and then having a discussion about it. So we're trying to imprint that information on them so they have a better understanding of what it is. We also talk a lot about self-talk, which is the sort of inner thoughts you have that lead you to justify your abuse or lead you to be abusive. And we look at the effects of abuse on partners and children too. Now the next slide. Okay. Another key thing we do is talk about what is respectful behavior and disrespectful behavior. And that can be helpful for people, even after they've stopped their physically abusive and controlling behavior. We're working at how can they have respectful relationships, and not just with their partners and their children, but with people in general. So this is going to affect their family life, but it's also going to affect how they approach other people in life too. After they attend 8 sessions, if they've admitted some abuse, they're moved on to a second stage group, which are generally somewhat smaller. People are in there for 32 weeks, so they know each other and they're more committed and they have higher expectations. The group themselves are more interactive. Instead of just being educational like they were for the first 8 weeks, we allow people to give feedback to each other and to challenge each other. And we want them to be interactive. During the first 8 weeks, we're trying to educate them. So we want them to listen, participate in the educational activities, but we don't want them to give feedback to other people because they're not yet ready to give feedback to others. So we expect they are going to be more confronted with other group members in terms of challenging their behaviors and their continued use of abuse or controlling behavior. Most people who are sent to Emerge are sent there because they're court referred, but not a 90%. It's more like a 70% of the people are either court or probation or parole referred. And quite a few people are voluntary and choose to come because their relationship may be ending or their partner may be asking them to come to an abuser education program.
That's really interesting. Is there a difference between those populations, people who are court referred versus people who are self-referred?
Yeah, I mean, I personally find the people who are court referred easier to deal with because the people who are voluntary often feel more entitled because they feel like I haven't been arrested, so I'm better than the guy sitting next to me who's actually gone to jail or at least been arrested. And I'm here of my own free will or my own choice. But in reality, everybody is. You could be arrested and sent to an intimate partner abuse education program and choose not to come too. Some people do. So they're choosing to come. But a lot of times people are being pressured by their partners who are voluntary, but they take, sort of umbrance with, I'm better than the other person next to me.
So Damion, I understand you started the Emerge program shortly before the lockdowns happened last year. Tell us a little bit about why it's important for you to be here and share your experience with our viewers.
Well, correct. And Susan already, I think, touched on a lot of the things that crossing my mind in advance of participating today. But, I started the first 8 weeks before the pandemic started. And then I think I had 1 or 2 groups. And then we went fully virtual for the remainder of my time in the program. And like she was saying, I think a lot of us, I came there through the court system for my abuse. And, when, at least for me, when I walked in the door, I'm thinking of abuse as something involving like physical violence. And we learned that the abuse is so much more than that. It has to do with, like she was saying, controlling behavior, disrespectful communication, and so many things, how we interact with our partners that, we didn't, I think as participants, we didn't really realize how how awful those things were. But when we start discussing them, when we start hearing each other's experiences with their partners, it all comes to light that we need to change other things about how we act, and not just worry about striking our partners. Because I don't think that for a lot of people that come there, it was necessarily that they were like beating their partners frequently, or that was like the main issue in their relationship. That may have happened at some point, but I think we all then discovered that we all certainly had other issues that we had in common pretty consistently, whether that being controlling behavior or disrespectful communication. And it's been, for me as an individual, I haven't been in a relationship since my arrest. So, but like Susan also said, it has been beneficial for me, what I've learned, because I've put it into practice with my family, with my mom and my dad particularly. And, it's been quite positive for me at home. And I know that we have better interactions now as well. So for me, I've been very grateful for what I've learned, even though I haven't been able to use it in a relationship yet. I've been able to use it at home with my family.
Well, I think you're making a really good point in that so much of the kind of mindset and behavior that leads to abusive intimate partner relationships, it impacts all your relationships because it has to do with kind of a mindset. And I think that one of the most important lessons I always want people to take away from this education that we do is to really think more expansively about abuse. And let's not just think about black eyes and broken bones, because it's not just about laying your hands on somebody. It's about controlling them. So I'm really appreciative of your insight. Susan has been your counselor, so I'm going to invite her back on to this conversation. And Susan, maybe you could explore a little bit more about Damion's work in the program.
Yes. I think that what he was saying about like working on other behaviors other than the physical abuse is often harder, and that's people may stop the physical violence rather quickly, and it may have been limited, like he said, but the controlling behaviors, the hurtful behaviors, and the disrespect are very hard for people to recognize and control. And I know, with him, we worked on that with him over a long period of time, but I think when we did his relationship history and compared all of his past relationships, it seemed like it was helpful for him because he could sort of see how he had treated different women at different times and look at some of the commonalities in terms of disrespect and how he treated them. And that can be really helpful to somebody to realize that it's not just related to one person. It's also a pattern of how they treat people in general. So if you have had a couple of relationships, we will map them out for them and sort of look at the commonalities and the differences. So maybe, Damion, you could speak to that?
No, I just reminded me, the relationship history is definitely very insightful, especially if you've had 2 or 3 relationships to map out like that. And I remember with mine, we certainly started seeing similarities between the 3 or so young women that we were discussing.
How do you think that's going to affect being in a new relationship? I know the pandemic's been here for the last year and a half, and that's sort of curtailed your dating. But what do you think you learned from doing the relationship history and being at Emerge that's going to be helpful in the new relationship you may have in the future, let's say?
Well, I hope a lot of things will be different, honestly. And I'd like to think that my next relationship will probably be the most positive of all of them that I've had so far, because a lot of the behaviors from the past, I know for me, a lot of it was jealousy, and then, acting, maybe like giving attitude as a result of things that I was feeling internally and having that bring negativity to the relationship. I really hope that for my next relationship, whenever that comes, that I don't have those issues with my new partner. I hope that we start off at a much more positive place, and that I can be more respectful of their boundaries and not have what I'm describing is really negative self-talk, and not have as much negative self-talk that knowing myself, I have no problem in the past verbalizing what I felt if it was something negative. But I hope to really work through that stuff and not have to deal with it even internally.
I think one of the things with respect that we've talked a lot about is that it's hard to accept that people are different than us. And we often demand that they believe us or accept us as we are and act like we want them to. And that's one of the sort of characteristics of being respectful, is accepting that people are different. And, that's, as we've talked about in group, that's a hard thing to do sometimes, because we want to have control of relationships.
That is true. I may have an ideal of how I want somebody to act, but I'm going to have to accept somebody. They're going to have things about them that are contrary to what I like, unless I find somebody who's exactly like I am. But I doubt that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Even they would probably conflict.
Right.
But it's going to be exciting for me to start a new relationship and see where that goes. And I know one thing is I'm probably going to have to discuss my past with controlling behavior, which is, I think we've discussed that recently in group. That may be my one of the things I at least look forward to as far as dating in the future.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, I think that it won't be the biggest barrier, so long as I present myself in a positive way as well.
And I think that it's just so necessary to be honest with people about this past, because otherwise they feel sort of tricked. If you begin a relationship and they don't know about your past abuse, then they just sort of feel like, well, okay, now I really like you and want to be with you, and it's harder to make the choice not to be with you. So, we want people to be more upfront, which I think is what you're talking about. Yeah.
And also in a practical sense, also, I could also say this arrest is not online. Most things you get arrested for, your name is online for the offense.
Yeah.
So, this is one of those things where, you meet a new partner, they put in your full name into Google. They're actually not going to see that you had a domestic abuse case. At least for me, that's how it worked out. So, being open with them is probably going to be important, because if not, it'll come out in the wrong way in the future, whether it be from another person that a friend or
Mm-hmm.
acquaintance, and then that'll just be not good.
It's very interesting for us to kind of take a peek into your experience and the process that you're going through, and then you're in the middle of with Emerge. And I really appreciate you sharing that with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Damion.
So I do want to ask Ranit. So as a counselor, and, when talking about intimate partner violence, it can be really easy to talk black and white, right? Abusers are bad. Victims are good. Punish the bad guys, help the survivors. But, the reality is not quite so black and white, right? And I think that kind of thinking is limited, and gets in the way of change. So, Renee, could you talk to us a little bit about why it's important to work in the grays?
Well, I think when I started working in the field, I was in the same state of mind, seeing things as good and bad, woman good, man bad. And a lot of the things I learned very quickly, which are not true. One, we learned that women can also be abusive. This is not just about male, and there's also same-sex relationships where we see there's abuse. And that's also already a shift from the way we started as a movement, where it was thought that only male perpetrators abuse female victims. But it's also about, we are all living in the grays. When we go to extremes, no change can really happen. And I think I have evolved, and the movement has evolved, and seeing things will not change unless we start looking and working in the grays. Our clients, our population that we work with, that we help, if we demonize the people that they've been in relationship with, or that they'll be in relationship with forever. I'll never forget an amazing woman I worked with told me, I'm a grandmother and he is still in my life. So if these people are going to be in our clients' lives, we really have to find the best way to help them navigate those relationships. And again, these are the fathers or mothers of their children. If we demonize them and say they are bad, they will probably not come back to us or not even approach us in the first instance asking for help, because we are seeing these things in extremes. And it's also about offering options to survivors that are beyond shelter, which Sarah spoke about in the beginning. Some people don't want to leave everything behind. Some people can stay and negotiate some relationships differently. They can come to counseling. Their child can come to counseling, really offering options that are not extreme, because people are very much afraid about extreme changes in their lives, or even seeing the people that they were connected to in extreme ways. So we owe to them to work in the grays, and we're very excited to work with Emerge, because it's all about also coming out of silos. It cannot be that the domestic violence agency works in one little bubble that doesn't communicate with other bubbles, because our lives are not in bubbles. Everything is fluid, and we have to be fluid in what we offer our survivors.
Yeah, it's profound, and it's been my experience. And I'm kind of new to this field. I came back to my social work roots doing the film Finding Jen's Voice, and I talked to all kinds of people working in the field, but it did feel like that so much of the services were siloed and the information was siloed. And as long as, we're working like that, systemic change isn't going to happen, because that's just not how systemic change happens. It happens when we all talk to each other. So we've had the benefit in this webinar of talking to somebody who's been a perpetrator of abusive behavior, who's working through that. We also have in this webinar a survivor of intimate partner violence. So Susan, you were in an abusive relationship more than 25 years ago. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
When I first met James, I was a single mother and working as a graduate assistant, teaching freshman and sophomore English, trying to put myself through my doctorate program. And these were hard times for me. And I had a lively child. And James was a charmer, and he was an academic, a professor of linguistics. He had a social conscience, had even marched with Martin Luther King. We enjoyed the same kinds of music and had a sense, both were very interested in literature. And so he charmed me quickly. I went into the relationship very quickly. By the way, I advise against that. But he was just fine. And it was months before even the emotional and mental abuse began. That began, he didn't scream and cuss at us. He said cruel things and trolled us in part by, well, me in particular, because I usually put my daughter by seeing that she was in her room when he was in a mood like that. Manipulated me into believing that his meanness was a direct result of my behavior, because something was wrong with me. And he sent me to therapists and psychiatrists, and these were the olden days. Not much was known on this topic. And they all worked very hard to help me figure out what I was doing wrong to cause him to behave this way. He also isolated me. That usually begins fairly quickly. It's essential for an abuser to isolate the person he abuses, because otherwise she's going to get reality checks from the people who are close to her. He cannot afford for that to happen, or she's going to leave. So he did isolate me. He stole mail from my mother out of the mailbox, so I had no idea she was writing me for 2 years. I continued writing to her. She got no letters from me. It was all done through the mailbox at our home. And he was there more than I was because he only taught one class a day. I taught 2 classes a day and went to 2 of my own classes a day. So he took care of the meal for me. He was also a drinker, and I quickly learned to control how that went because when he started to drink the wine, he insisted I drink with him. I was probably easier to manipulate if I was high or drunk, but I knew I could not do that because I had to protect this child that was with me. So I would have the first glass of wine with him and always be the one to offer to go to the kitchen and pour another glass when he decided he wanted one, and would insist I have another with him. You can very quietly turn on a kitchen sink and pour yourself a nice glass of water. Did it for 4 years. It worked beautifully. Approximately 2 years into the relationship, he began to occasionally commit physical violence against me. It was rare, but he showed an incredible capacity for cruelty in that I watched an act of arson against someone else that he committed. He once beat me for leaving a door open. He beat me with a heavy oak hiking stick. I was covered with bruises. I was mainly crouched in a corner covering my head so that he wouldn't hit that and kill me. He would then be remorseful and go into the AA program or suggest we see a couples counselor because maybe what I couldn't work out by myself, we could work out together about why this was happening. In those days, even counselors and therapists weren't always aware that an abuser is entirely responsible for his own behavior and that no woman causes it. When it got bad enough, I had no choice but to run. We had in the meantime moved to the Boston area. Originally, we were in New Mexico. And I had to run with my daughter. And then ensued the court battles, the stalking, the restraining orders. He had one against me as well because I was cruel and abusive and made him drink, was what his restraining order said. But that did not look good in court. Those, as I say, were the olden days. Things were handled differently back then. As I was isolated pretty well, I was not allowed to have friends. He didn't say I couldn't have friends. He was just rude enough to them that they never came around again. I was allowed to have friends that were also his friends, and those people did not want to get involved in a marital split up. They thought it was probably, that they should remain impartial. So I had absolutely no support. Other than David Adams.
So,
He stepped in.
you're really describing the anatomy of an abusive relationship. You talk about a charming person who kind of systematically isolates you and then becomes emotionally abusive and only gradually becomes violent, but that violence kind of really shows you the cruelty. But there's also that huge controlling and manipulative behavior that you've described. And about the time that you were going through this, I was also a young counselor, right? I was a social worker, and I was doing child and family and couples therapy. And I think back on those times, and I think, I didn't recognize it's a partner violence. I had absolutely no training in it. It was definitely a different time. I cringe when I think about some of the conversations that I had with women who, when I look back, were probably in an abusive relationship, though they hadn't defined it as such.
I didn't recognize it as an abusive relationship either.
Right.
I had not heard of such a thing.
But then you talk about then entered David Adams, and
Yes.
I'm bringing him on screen so he can share in this.
We've been friends since. Yeah.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about how Emerge helped you. You told me when we talked earlier that David saved your life. Tell me about that.
He pretty much did. I made the call the day I had to cut and run. But then I called David Adams because about a month or so before, I had insisted, I had heard about the Emerge program, and I insisted that James attend, or I was leaving. After which he told me that he would attend to please me, but I would never live if I left him. So he attended Emerge. He would come home and say, well, your buddies seem to be well on your side on everything. But they did a partner contact, and David did that partner contact. That meant he called me when I was alone and free to talk to him. My daughter was not around, and my husband was not around. And he let me know that he knew and felt, both cognitively and emotionally, that James had the potential to be incredibly dangerous, and that he wanted to make me aware of that. But my decisions would always be my own. And he gave me a phone number to call. And then when I did have to cut and run, as they say, I did call David. I didn't know about Transition House, which was probably the only battered women's shelter in existence at that point and wouldn't have had room for me anyway. But we found a school friend of my daughter whose family was happy to take us in for a couple of days until we got things sorted out. And I spoke with David pretty regularly, actually. He made time for me. He helped me see more clearly what was being done to me during this very abusive period of even police abuse. They would lie about what had happened when they were coming to watch James remove things of his from the house. They would have to throw him out. He was so cruel and abusive to me, and then file the report that all went well. And it just didn't go well. Those were the olden days, as I say. But David was always there. And he just answered questions honestly and gently, as David always is. And that was what I hung on to. He even helped me find a lawyer I could afford who had some experience with women escaping abusers through the courts.
That Susan's case, David, really kind of illustrates your philosophy in terms of protecting victims first. Do you have any comments about Susan's case? And you are muted.
Well, I remember being worried about Susan, and this is something that we do. It's our responsibility to assess what we call lethality. Not all of the people who attend Emerge have really the potential to kill their partners. But in James's cases, I could picture that. I could picture how he could become activated through the divorce process, how he was very intent on maintaining control, and that he would do anything, potentially even killing Susan and even her daughter, in order to maintain control. And so that really worried me, and we feel compelled, to share that information with the potential victims in this case. So, and so that is an important part of what we do.
I think it's really illustrative of the importance of having that victim-centered philosophy, and probably the reason you've had such longevity with your program. Because I have known of other abuser education programs that haven't lasted very long and haven't been very effective. And I think that that's probably the missing link. So I do want to I want to just talk a little bit kind of bigger picture, right? So when I first started showing my documentary film, Finding Jen's Voice, which is about intimate partner homicide, afterwards I would be overwhelmed as audiences would invariably come up to me and say, all right, what do we do to fix this problem? How do we fix this problem? And I was like, I don't know. I'm just one person. I'm a filmmaker. What do I know? I was really overwhelmed. But I wanted to, in my conversations with all of you, it's clear that there are things that we can do, and you have all talked about transformative practices. So Sarah, I want to bring you back to talk to us about transformative practices. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, it can be hard after hearing such a story as Susan shared to think about that abusive person as a whole person who's capable of change. And I sometimes we just need to sit very still with that reality that is very hard, and the community of care that is required to help someone make that change is an enormous lift. So I don't have like magical thinking about that person being able to change on their own, but I do believe change is possible, and that change happens in the context of community and healthy community. So transformative practices has an underlying tenet that is that when people of authority do things with us rather than to us or for us, we are more likely to make positive change in our lives. And so if we think about how consequences that we're used to, like the criminal justice system, is not really a system that's designed to help you make change alongside you. It is demanding that you change, and you're not given much support. So in a context of support, I think a person is more likely to change. And so in our work with survivors, what we hear is that that person is going to be in someone's life for a long time. As Ronit said earlier, especially if there's children involved, it's very difficult to make a full separation from that person. And so we try to look at the situation as a complex whole where people are complex, human beings are complicated, and each one of us is not the sum of the worst thing we've ever done or the worst behavior we've ever exhibited, that we're more complicated than that, and that change is possible. And that social capital, the relationships we have with other people in our lives, can help us make that positive change that we want. But that happens only when, as we talked about earlier, those communities are aware of domestic violence, they are aware of abusive behavior, they are aware of the signs of these troubling relationships where power and control is happening, and also where people are willing to step into that power and use that social capital as a way to say, I see what's happening here, and I'd like to help you choose a different path. Now that is our dream. So to get there, we partner with organizations like Emerge to really come together. I mean, if you think about the outreach that Emerge does, we also are available to the folks at Emerge to support victims. So coming together to use our power together to transform our community is our goal.
I do appreciate the working together and the outreach, and and change is slow and messy and not so easy to always achieve. But I'm going to start with Susan Clare and just ask her. You've been around now for more than 25 years since you were a victim of abuse, and you have seen a lot of changes, and you've done a lot of advocacy work yourself. So just real quickly, tell us about some of the changes you've seen in the community and in our general awareness of domestic violence.
Strictly social is that it is largely seen by the population in the United States, the community of us all, as unacceptable to abuse a person. And it used to be a man's own business what he did with his family. So we have made incredible progress in that. The support of the community is often lacking simply because they don't know what to do or how to do it. And they don't know how to do it safely because certain things they might do or encourage an abused woman to do can endanger her or her children. And so you actually do need to know what you're doing then. So there is where the people at Transition House and Emerge are great teachers. And they do teach constantly. There are workshops. I've spoken at many of them. They'll ask me, do you have time to come tell your story? They do with other people as well, I know. I even I got certified as a batterer counselor because I felt it was a necessary part of my education. Part of that was to sit in on meetings and observe them. And it was a quick realization for me that coming from my experience, no matter how many years later it was, I could not feel the compassion for these men that a good counselor has to, because these men do need support. They will not change without a community around them. They will not change without a supportive community, a community that is aware of what they have done and what they are doing and committed to helping them correct that. I was unable to function in that respect, I determined, and I still think that was right. We've also had quite a few changes in the law in Massachusetts, at least, in which wonderful things are happening. If an altercation is had at a residence and the woman is bruised, she does not even have to press charges against the man. The police are going to do it. It is much more difficult for judges and police to further abuse battered women than it used to be. So many good changes have been made, both in the law, but particularly in the field of reaching out. We have far more shelters. We have far more hotlines. I do think that leaning on the idea of community is critical because it's difficult to feel alone and not find support if you're a stolid member of a solid community. And I've found that in my life, and my life is a very rich one now. And that may be why you see a survivor of domestic abuse on here able to smile more than the rest of you are, because you're still in the thick of it working. I ceased working at that about 10 years ago. But my life is very rich. I have learned a lot and I can use it.
The historical perspective is so important. It gives us that, who was it that said, if we don't understand history, we're doomed to repeat it. So I think that having that perspective is hopeful, and it helps us to think about how do we get to the end, right? So I'm going to ask everybody, in your opinion, what do you think? Are we making progress? Are we getting to the end of learning about eliminating intimate partner violence? Susan has given us some hope. What does everybody else think? David, why don't you pop in there and tell us what lessons you've learned?
Well, I feel very privileged to have worked with men like Damion, and I kind of have this very kind of funny metaphor, of what we do with the people that we work with. I think, Damion, come here. I want to show you something. Come over here. Stand over here. And then we like push him in a hole, right? And then he's in this hole where he has to sort of figure out how to get out of this hole, right? And that involves self-reflection, right? It's not like, ladders or ropes or anything. It's only through self-reflection, that Damion and men like Damion are able to sort of figure out how to get out of that situation, to change, right? And so I feel privileged to have started these conversations with men, about relationships. I also feel privileged to have worked with Sarah and Ramit and Susan K. Wett and Susan Clare to kind of share the information that we've acquired. I mean, we've acquired a body of knowledge, right? That's really quite essential. I mean, other people don't have this information, right? And so it really behooves us to share this information of what we've learned. And lately, there's been a lot more kind of thought about, like, even mass shooters, right? How many of them have connections to domestic violence. And so I think of domestic violence as a canary in the mine, right? Where it's the early warning sign that something is really wrong here, right? And lately, we sort of see how it interconnects with other issues like racism and classism, and homophobia. It all sort of comes together, into this one interconnected problem. And so that's been the lesson for me, is how interconnected it really is.
It's a much bigger issue than just what happens behind closed doors belongs behind closed doors, because what happens behind closed doors is happening outside, and it has an impact on us all. How close are we to eliminating intimate partner violence? You each get 1 minute.
Oh.
Go, Sarah.
Okay. Just going to say, I'd love to jump in here and say that a great step to ending intimate partner violence would be to fully fund programs like Emerge. It's a lot more comfortable for people and governments to fund victim service programs like Transition House. But the reality is our work works when David and Susan Kayote's work is going well and they're fully funded and they can staff their programs at the rates that they want to staff their programs. So I would say, yes, we're on a good path, but we need to understand all these dynamics and all this expertise that the folks at Emerge have and capitalize on that. It's not being capitalized on right now to the level that it could be because of funding. So I would push for more funding.
Well, we want to change that, don't we? And that is part of the reason we're here today. Susan Kayote, what are your thoughts?
I sort of am leaning towards Ronit's explanation of some of the problems earlier, that things are not dichotomous, that life is complex. The people we see in the abuser education programs are complex. They've experienced their own abuse and controlling behavior, either personally or through society, through poverty and race or homophobia. And it's we have to deal with that too. We have to try to integrate that into our response too. Just like somebody who comes to Transition House may be abused at that moment, but may have been abusive to another partner at a different time. So everything is much more complex than we thought it was 45 years ago when this all started. And I don't think it's near an end in terms of like us solving it, but I think we are working on it and realizing there's a lot more work to do. And it's more difficult work in some ways than we even thought it was.
Yeah, I hear you. Damion, I'll put you on the spot. Do you think we are headed in the right direction?
From what I see in the many groups I've participated in, I think that at least what we're doing in Emerge, I think is going in the right direction. I think that when people graduate from the program, as we say, I think they walk out of there in a much more positive mindset. Seriously. Some people, you meet them and you're like, wow, they seem kind of negative. But then by the end of the program, they kind of lighten up a little bit and they seem to be in a better place. So I'd like to think that a lot of positivity is coming from the work that they're doing. I know for me, it's done a lot of great in my life, my family, and I think it'll do great, a lot of good in the future in our relationships too.
Thank you. It is hard when you're working, one person at a time to just keep that focus on that it has a ripple effect across the whole society. Ronit, you get the last word.
I think we forget also to talk about prevention, about doing things much earlier in life, and also talking about what's healthy. I think for so many people, we tell them, what's bad, what's unhealthy, but they don't even know what the healthy is. So we have to start early and invest, again, if talking about funding and prevention, starting as little as kindergarten, in talking about respectful behavior, what's good and bad there. So children know the difference, but also one of the things we didn't talk about is that many people that are causing harm, they were caused harm or witnessed harm when they were children. So addressing that. So there's a lot of pain that people that cause harm are sometimes carrying from mimicking or being victims themselves of their parents being abusive towards them. So knowing how to treat that and be kind about those histories. And as I said, again, not working in the black and the white.
Thank you all for being here. What a great panel discussion. I think we could have gone on for another hour, but we are not. So I do want to thank you all for the work that you're doing to prevent gender-based violence. And I want to thank the audience for being here and being a voice for change. This webinar will be available for streaming in a few weeks, and you can find that as well as other resources and more information about intimate partner violence and prevention and education on our website, voicesforchange.net. So please visit us there, and thanks for tuning in. See you next time.